Gwe, Uppsala. Hello, welcome. My name is Neil, and I am the Faculty Excellence Developer here at the Maple League of Universities. I'm joining you today from beautiful Kjibuktuk, which is colonially called Halifax in Nova Scotia. This is in unceded Mi'kmaq territory. We've got people from across Turtle Island and around the world joining us, so I invite you to please let me know if you'd like in the chat where you are coming from. Welcome to Pandemic Spectres in the Classroom. Our guest today is a professor of women and gender studies at St. Francis Xavier University. Her research is concerned with the relationships between power, embodiment, and culture, especially visual culture, from the perspectives of psychoanalysis and decolonial thought. She's the author of Surface Imaginations, Cosmetic Surgery, Photography, and Skin, editor of Representing Abortion, and co-editor of Skin, Culture, and Psychoanalysis. Her most recent essays have been published in History of Photography, Feminist Studies, Configurations, and Body and Society. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Hurst. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Right on. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen here. Okay, so I am joining you from Mi'kmaq as well. I'm here in my office at St. Francis Xavier University, which is on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. The lands on which this university were built were stolen and never surrendered. And additionally, these lands are significant to African Nova Scotian communities. A small settlement of Black families lived on campus, on the lands that are now campus, and the apple trees still grow near the St. FX sign on West Street. And I thank my colleague, Tara Reddick, for sharing this history with me. So I'm going to begin by reading the words of queer migration scholar Karma Chavez. And so I'm just going to start with this. So she says, "But your world has gotten so small. You've experienced loss anew and revisited, quotidian and spectacular, and your relationship to time is completely fucked up. You know, you probably should be grateful for this disjuncture, this breach of normative time in a way. After all, this could be the kind of rupture that feminists and queers and the disabled have longed for. But you haven't experienced it that way. You felt your grief, past, present, and future threat with a palpability that suffocates. And the only thing you can think to do is to try and reckon with it, as in to give an accounting of this pandemic time, your experiences of this pandemic time, and the times before it that it's brought to the fore. And your only hope is that it will resonate, produce a reverberation, and that echo, like the flicker of the candle, will create comfort, maybe some resolution." So I'm really grateful for Neil's invitation to present today, as it really opened up a space for me to think about and write something that's been on my mind for 3 years now, which is quite hard to believe as I say that out loud. Delving into the fascinating scholarly work on academic labor in the pandemic, trauma-informed classroom practices for classroom teaching, and the pandemic as an experience of loss, grief, and trauma, have felt like entering into a conversation with friendly colleagues who I would love to gather with to release a collective primal scream into the void. And I suspect that you, the audience, are also there as well. And so Karma Chavez captures several themes that I want to address in this talk. And the first is the loneliness of loss and the contraction of the world that has been brought on by the pandemic. The second is the time-bending quality of grief, in which one loss connects back to all other experiences of loss and can render the future an anxious and lonely place. And the third is the potential for solidarity and coalition through trying to reckon with what has and is currently happening in this pandemic time. So to give a bit of an overview of where I'd like to go, and please, Neil, if there are questions that kind of arise in the chat, just feel free to go for it and interrupt me. And I've sort of put in a couple of times in this talk for us to reflect and think together. But I'd like to start by offering a framework through which I'm trying to think about my experiences as an educator through this pandemic, which understands the process of learning as in itself lonely and as a loss, infused with loss already, and that this loss has been amplified through the pandemic. Second, I want to share some of the things that I've learned from engaging with the scholarship of pandemic educators, specifically understanding the pandemic as a shared trauma and the difficulties acknowledging the losses of the pandemic within the context of widespread institutional gaslighting. And third, I want to kind of talk about the inspiration for a project to document the courage of students and colleagues over the past 3 years. And in particular, I'm interested in 2 questions that I'm going to return to at the end, which are, what have we learned about the classroom as a space in which it is possible to hold loss and grief? And second, how can we ensure that this caring labor remains visible and valued? And most of all, something that I want to encourage all of us to do is to refuse the violence of normal and instead imagine what might be, something that might be different. So I'm going to return, or I'm kind of making a stretch back to, this was the first real journal article that I published. It was a reflection, a critical analysis and documentation of what I learned about feminist pedagogy through the simultaneous experiences of learning how to become a teacher at the same time that my dad died. In addition to leading tutorials for first-year students in the Division of Social Sciences and Fine Arts Cultural Studies at York University, I also participated in and then facilitated mutual support groups for young adults who had lost a parent or sibling, as well as groups for queer and trans people who had experienced any kind of loss with bereaved families, Ontario, Toronto. So the confluence of these life events pushed me to consider how educators and students bring our loss histories into the classroom. In referring to loss histories, of course, I meant death, but also I meant far more than that. Then, as now, I confront the same questions that I feel I'm faced with. What do I do with this loss? And then how can I respond to it? So, although she doesn't frame it this way, here Dr. Kate S. Kirby notices what loss histories look like when they show up in the classroom. So in this tweet, she asks, if you change, my students are so disengaged right now. 2, my students are living through trauma, grief, chaos, and looking at a bleak future. Does that make any kind of difference? So as before the pandemic, I've continued to be faced with the problem of few or no students having read before class. At times, half of the class has been missing. When students are in the class, some are obviously working on other assignments for other courses, some are shopping online, and others are scrolling on their phones. Even the broadest questions that are asked to get a sense of where the class is at that day and what they might know about a particular topic seem to fall flat. Of course, one of the best ways to sort of get people engaged is to ask them questions about themselves. And even those can just flop like a lead balloon. Students are making calculated decisions about which assignments to hand in and which to forget about. And in that context, it's very hard not to make it personal, to say, I am a failure, or they are disengaged. But what I think is so provocative about this tweet by Kirby is that it asks us to remember that we are still living in a pandemic and that all of us have lost, although not equally. So before, I kind of talk about thinking about sort of loss and loneliness in the classroom, I'm wondering if people have other ideas about how does loss show up in your classrooms. And I'm going to try to come back so that I can see what's going on. There we go. Are there any thoughts about that, about what that looks like? So I can see in the chat, Juan Carlos Lopez says it's hard to interact with others, in students' views changing in ways that make it hard to connect with their families back home, lots of anxiety, unexpected or new sensitivities to topics. Some disabled students have not returned to schools at all. Teachers had a sense of loss and grief in the classroom during the pandemic. They felt that loss for themselves, colleagues, and for their students, loss of learning growth and connection, the challenge of time management. Students are often very grateful when you name how hard and upsetting things are. The feedback I've gotten is that very few faculty are naming this explicitly. The idea that the pandemic is over is not their truth. Loss of visual reinforcement of communication in a language class. We didn't see each other's faces. Unable to attend due to living with high-risk parents, roommates, etc. Loss during the pandemic is not always death. Time management was an issue. I have had more students share their struggles and contexts with me more than before the pandemic. Right now, I'm seeing students mourning the loss of opportunities to continue their studies as online courses are increasingly scaled back. And everything feels very high stakes to them. 0.5% of a grade, gentle feedback, etc., becomes overwhelming for them. So I think that that's, those are really, really excellent comments. And thinking, what I appreciate about these comments is the way that they conceptualize loss as not just about death and dying, but also about all kinds of loss. And something that I'm going to talk about is how we can actually think about, and I think it might have been Neil said something in the chat about how the experience of learning is in itself a loss, can mean a loss of connection to one's friends and family in terms of, letting go of ideas that have been, just a part of life and embracing new ones. Yeah, and so I appreciate, these comments. And then, of course, the losses of how thinking about, the quote unquote return to normal and going back to the classroom has really intensified inequities, particularly for students with disabilities. And I'm going to kind of share and talk about that in a moment. I found some interesting scholarship about that. So my understanding of learning is greatly shaped by psychoanalyst and educator Deborah Britzman, whose work has been concerned with this destabilizing realization that I have up here. This is from her book, After Education, which is that we can make education from experiences that were never meant to be education, and that unnerves our educational enterprise. So the semester that my father was diagnosed with cancer for the final time, I was enrolled in Britzman's pedagogy and psychoanalytic theory class, where my intimate and precious intellectual explanations of human experience were ruptured. And I had to let go of my theories of a consciousness that could be reasoned with and understood, and was confronted with the possibilities of an unconscious logic that was unknowable and singular. I remember this time as one of the loneliest of my life. And loss and loneliness are two intertwined experiences that were never meant to be education. So they're examples of what Britzman says, but nevertheless, they make education. They're a part of our education. So learning, in my understanding, is a process of letting go, and that process is often very lonely. Britzman describes Melanie Klein and Anna Freud's understandings of loneliness as, quote, a fragile bridge necessary for thinking to cross from the emptiness of loss and anxiety and into the poignant work of mourning and reparation, end quote. And that's also from Britzman's book. So when we are in a classroom together, we are still fundamentally alone. We risk the loneliness of not being understood or heard, as well as the potential of recognizing that the knowledge, theories, and ideas that we hold close are no longer ones that we want to hold on to, or perhaps even worse, are worthless to those around us. In many classes, we are constrained by language, which will never articulate what we are thinking and feeling. We are not everything we say, and each of us is alone together in the classroom. So loneliness can be theorized as an absence or a gap, or if we position it in another way, as an opening or as a desire. And feeling lonely is a step toward integrating loss into one's life. It is uncomfortable, it's uncomfortable, unsettling, disturbing, but necessary. So when we feel lonely as a result of our education, as a result of engaging with the processes of learning, or that we have lost something precious as a result of our education, it's often because we have lost something that we've idealized in some way, which is an event that provokes resistance and anxiety because it positions education as destructive rather than accumulative, and as creation rather than mastery. So it really sort of reveals that messiness, that unfinished quality of learning. And that's something that is really disturbing to ideas of education as accumulation and mastery. So Freud characterized learning as a working through. That is not a process of acquiring knowledge about oneself and the world, but instead as an interference into our psychic life that is disruptive. And similarly, he characterized mourning as hard work, in that we process all of our memories of what we have lost in order to integrate that loss and re-engage with the external world that has changed forever as a result of that loss. So I really love in these characterizations of thinking about learning as working through, but also mourning as painful work. I love the emphasis of the work in those conceptualizations. The process of unlearning and relearning and confronting one's own history of learning is a visceral one that often feels uncomfortable and profoundly destabilizing. A classroom can feel like a space in which our interior lives are being interfered with publicly, and where we need to turn inward to process that interference before we are able to reach out and re-engage. And Britsman notes that loneliness allows one to reach out to the world. The bridge of loneliness might move us to reach out and make connections to those around us and to acknowledge our own and others' difference. So in preparing for this talk, I engaged with and read quite a bit about loneliness in the pandemic and loss in the pandemic, and sort of how different scholars have been thinking about this. And to, say at the outset, so as of the 12th of April, according to the World Health Organization, 6,897,025 people worldwide have died as a result of COVID-19. The grief following those deaths is complicated, as people died alone due to fears of transmitting the virus, as social inequality became visible to those of us privileged to work from home while others were exposed to the virus and became sick on the job. As vaccine inequity escalated, so that those of us in the global north received multiple booster shots and throw out vaccines, while those in the global south have not even begun a primary series of vaccination. And as we live in such a hellscape that even hospitals this week are announcing lifting mask mandates and advise people to stay home if they're feeling sick. So sorry, I want to repeat that on Monday, the McMaster Children's Hospital sent out a tweet saying that they are making masking optional in the hospital, and that if you feel unwell, you should stay home. I just really want to emphasize just how horrific this is. And as a result, disabled and immunocompromised people have and will continue to die as a result of this callous abandonment. But intriguingly, if you look for scholarly articles about the subject of pandemic loss, you'll encounter two major themes. The first is the loss of smell and taste as a persistent symptom of COVID-19 during and after infection. And the second is a little bit more related, and that's children's learning loss as a result of school closures. Those are sort of the two big themes that come up in that search string. So early in the pandemic, psychologist Eric D. Miller referred to COVID-19 as, quote, the loss and trauma event of our time, which is an idea that I'm going to return to shortly. But Mike Ruffino and Kushia Sugarman caution us not to pigeonhole loneliness and loss as individual psychological issues, but instead to consider how loneliness is an equity issue that is shaped by structural relations of privilege and oppression. And I found a really good example of this in Kelly Optics' work, which, several of the examples that people were giving of what loss looks like when it shows up in the classroom really aligned well with her analysis. So she identifies 3 failures that she's observed in the return to the classroom. And I think that I would characterize all of these failures as also lonely losses, additionally. So she talks about how disabled students peaked into an experience of education that was more accessible, which was quickly snatched away with a return to unmasked classrooms and course policies that centered non-disabled students. The second example that she gives or analyzes is how working class students were excited to be able to engage with their studies in a more flexible manner that was easier to manage with work responsibilities, which was lost with a return to scheduled classes and rigid attendance policies. And the final example that she gives is how first-generation students were subjected to the experience of learning sort of the unwritten rules or the hidden curriculum in academia, only to have that, I think the phrase that she uses is to have the rug pulled out from under them every semester when we try to adapt and take on new pedagogical strategies. So those are sort of 3 failures or lonely losses that she identifies in there. And each of these failures is created through structural forces. As Ruffino and Sugarman argue, loneliness has not only been amplified through the contraction of the world during the pandemic, but political structures and actors fuel racism and xenophobia. And to that, I would add, amongst other structural relations of privilege and oppression, which impact students' sense of belonging and can be experienced as a loss of community and personal safety. So in here, I just want to kind of summarize that loneliness is both a psychic and also a socio-political condition and experience. So I want to move to kind of thinking about what it might mean to think about the experience of the pandemic as a collective but unequally experienced or felt trauma, as well as sort of thinking about the calls to returning to normal in the classroom and elsewhere. So in the summer of 2020, and I'm sure, this was circulated quite widely, I'm sure many of you encountered this, Kathy Davidson wrote that all of our efforts to respond to the pandemic will be wasted if we do not, quote, begin from the premise that our students are learning from a place of dislocation, anxiety, uncertainty, awareness of social injustice, anger, and trauma. So are we. And so one of the reasons why I think that this piece was shared so widely is that it was really kind of critiquing some of the inclinations to kind of find a technological or pedagogical fix to the pandemic, trying to, respond to the pandemic, imagining that, we had the capacity to, sort of make everything semi-normal if we just use the right strategies. And I think the other reason why this piece was so resonant is that she also offered a message of hope and why education is so critical in the pandemic, and why we occupy a really privileged role to be able to be a part of that, in that she said that education is an excellent way of moving beyond trauma to a place of agency, confidence, control, community care, and contribution. So in critical trauma studies, trauma is understood as not arising from an experience that holds sort of essential qualities, but rather from the mind's response to that experience. And then further, trauma is a socially constructed concept, and the experience of oppression is traumatizing in and of itself. So the disruptions of the pandemic were and are traumatic, compounded by other collective traumas like racist police violence, anti-trans legislation and discourse, mass shootings, and many others that we can think about. So many educators have asked how our pedagogy can be trauma-informed, including the excellent Better Together session by Dr. Bertie Bezenson last fall, and I highly recommend watching that one. I don't have the sort of time to be able to go into the causes and far-reaching effects of trauma, or the multiple ways that educators have developed trauma-informed pedagogies, but I encourage you to watch that talk, because I think that it does, sort of go into depth and get into that. And as someone who is adapting to living with long COVID, I found it completely fascinating that Bezenson's talk identified, what trauma looks like in terms of, what is happening, and the symptoms of long COVID. So things like having difficulty focusing, remembering and finding words, emotional dysregulation, fatigue, fear and anxiety, and feelings of isolation. And I found that really interesting to kind of think about how those, I guess, those symptoms or how those things appear overlap and connect with each other. And I think that is quite significant. So in terms of my experience as an educator, it has been that we've not been particularly successful in responding to this trauma. And this has been shaped by working in institutions that prioritize productivity and preservation and hinder more radical transformations. So one of the interventions, I guess, that I have attempted in my classes, in my critical race and sexuality studies class. One of the first texts that we read together was Dion Brand's Toronto Star article on narrative reckoning and the calculus of living and dying, in which Brand highlights how the calls to get back to normal are also calls to return to a life in which oppression and domination continue and become invisible once again. And what has been so interesting working with this article, they also, did an assignment that was partially based on this article, was the way that that framework shaped how they read other texts, including texts that, came before the pandemic, and, asked questions of, let's say, say, for example, that we are talking about starlight tours in Saskatoon. How has that violence become either more visible or has become more invisible in the pandemic? How has that happened? And so the article in many ways became a framework through which, the students and I were reading and learning, and that was kind of an unanticipated effect. So my university, and I'm sure like many, yeah, Neil.
Rachel, for the sake of our audience,
Yeah.
Many of whom are from international, could you explain what Starlight Tours means?
Absolutely, yes. So Starlight Tours referred to, so we read a chapter from Shireen Razek's book, Dying from Improvement. And Starlight Tours refers to the police practice of picking up Indigenous people in the city, in downtown Saskatoon, and driving them out far beyond city limits into into the countryside in minus 40 degrees Celsius cold, which of course has resulted in a number of deaths. There have been inquests and inquiries into Starlight Tours. There's a great episode of the Canada Land Commons series on the police about Starlight Tours, if people are interested in hearing the words of friends and family that have been impacted, and also just learning about it more generally. Yeah, is that helpful? Thanks, Neil, I appreciate that. So kind of thinking about, like, how does the pandemic shape how we understand some of these things? So my university has been promising a more normal semester since the fall of 2020. And here we've seen how capitalism has shaped our understandings of risk assessment, in that in-person teaching was deemed a reasonable risk before vaccines or even good information about the COVID-19 virus was available. And the only time that this institution was entirely remote was in March of 2020 for the couple of weeks that were remaining of the term. And so, like Dion Brand, I have come to absolutely hate, she uses the word hate, and I concur, this invocation of normal, which has been used to gaslight us into thinking that our legitimate collective concerns are individual anxiety. The word anxiety keeps coming up, which I think is used in order to kind of internalize that. And the suggestion too, which also individualize it, that our legitimate collective concerns our legitimate collective concerns can be addressed by individual things like accessing provincial mental health supports or our employee and family assistance plan. So then in the classroom, this relentless call to get back to normal also individualizes and pathologizes student responses to the losses engendered by the pandemic and its attendant crises. which, we could come up with a large, number of those. So I want, the last thing, that I'm going to kind of speak with, and I want us to kind of maybe open out into a bit of discussion of the ways that we've responded to this specter of loss in our classrooms, and kind of thinking about what has worked, what hasn't, and how can we move forward. And after making a couple of comments about what is shaping up to be a project of documenting and critically reflecting on what has happened over the past 3 years, I want to return to the 2 questions that I asked at the beginning and turn them over to all of us as a group. Which is, for the past 3 years, what have we learned about the classroom as a space in which it is possible to hold loss and grief? And how can we ensure that caring labor remains visible and valued? And so something that I've been, in getting ready for this talk, and also in, connecting with students, is I've been embarking on a project in which I'd like to more formally continue some conversations that I've been having with students. One of the things that has struck me in preparing for this talk is that the students who had the end of their first year, disrupted through the pandemic and throughout their degrees, they're going to be graduating this spring. And I don't want to lose some of the conversations that we've had about, how the pandemic has kind of impacted their learning, as well as sort of this return to normal and kind of the unequal landscape of what that looks like. So in thinking about these questions, something that has really struck me are the many often small ways that colleagues and students have refused normal, and how that really creates ripples that inspire and transform my own teaching. So initially, when I first proposed this talk, what I had envisioned is that I would write up some vignettes to share with you of these moments of resistance, but I thought it might be more interesting to sort of have a bit of a conversation about these. But what I'm saying when I'm talking about these is I'm thinking about things like being transparent with students about the reality that we are workers, and sort of framing deadlines in that way, that, deadlines are not always about disciplining students or, sort of imposing this rigidity, but they also are about our work conditions, and why that's important. Or, responding to student requests to talk about issues that, have arisen that are related to or unrelated to our classroom. So 2 examples that kind of came to mind were student requests to talk about the disruption of Hurricane Fiona this past fall. And I can remember last year in my intro class, students wanted to talk about the beginning of the Mass Casualty Commission in Nova Scotia, because they had friends and family who were impacted, and talking about violence was a part of the course. And so they wanted to kind of have space to sort of talk about that. And what was true about many of these conversations is that they were connected to many other experiences of loneliness and loss throughout the pandemic. But before we do that, I just want to sort of briefly caution us about being overly sentimental about care, as I'm kind of troubled by the way that care sort of So a lot of these conversations get framed in terms of care. So this was the 50th anniversary issue of the journal Feminist Studies. Addressed a number of topics, and in it, Rebecca Herzig and Banu Subramaniam summarized decades of feminist research that demonstrated how the uncompensated and invisible labors of academia, like advising, mentoring, and counseling students who are marginalized, writing reference letters, or we could also say attending teaching seminars like this, are largely performed by feminized workers, and specifically feminized workers of color, which duplicates the unequal distribution of caretaking labor in the home and elsewhere. And throughout the pandemic, they draw our attention to how universities have shifted their communications efforts from showcasing faculty productivity, measured through their research grant dollars and numbers of publications, to highlighting the caring nature of the university. And caring nature of campuses. So they comment that, quote, care work heretofore ever present, but largely invisible within the university, has been rebranded as particularly laudatory and significant, in fact, essential, end quote. And they argue that in the pre-pandemic university, our employers gained access to our embodied labor through the power, or labor power through the discourse of love and devotion, and that this has intensified throughout the pandemic, which obscures institutional accountability and responsibility. So while care labor is, I think, essential to this work of responding to the specters of loss and loneliness in the pandemic classroom, I'm also really interested in how we continue to make that work visible as we engage in the process of, reflecting on what it is that we have learned. So I'm going to kind of turn it over to you and turn it over to sort of these questions of, what have we learned about the classroom as a space where it is possible to hold loss and grief? And how can we simultaneously ensure that caring labor remains visible, valued, and recognized? And I think for me, like what really struck me in preparing for this is the way that this first question is one that has really followed me for a long time. My dad died in 2004, and he was diagnosed with cancer in 2003. And so, it's been 20 years of sort of thinking about this question that I think the pandemic has really opened up. So I'd be interested in what people think.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And I will say, if you'd like to put up your virtual hand or turn on your camera and put up your real hand, we can go that way. If you'd like to share something in the chat, we can take thoughts that way as well. Pandemic teaching, you got to leave time for typing. Suzanne, I see your hand. Please go ahead.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you for a really interesting and thought-provoking talk. I have a question sort of coming out of your questions, and that's wondering if you had anything to say about leaders who care for faculty who are caring. Makes sense.
Yes. And that, I think, is such, I think that's such a it's such a great question, because, one of the things that has been, I guess, so troubling and frustrating, at least for me, is, and I know, I've heard this from colleagues in talking about it, is sort of the expectation that we are engaged, that we are engaged with, all kinds of stuff related to like accommodating students, getting into all kinds of different accommodations and caring for students, and sort of these empty expressions of appreciation for it, when those accommodations do not seem to be available to us as faculty. So I'm the instance that kind of pops into my mind right now was sort of the here at St. FX, sort of the rigid holding to the deadlines for submission of annual evaluation dossiers, which were due, I think, the week after Hurricane Fiona. But it's just sort of an example, I think, of that kind of like, I guess, lack of care, and sort of the, I think there certainly have been some examples of how, or at least that I have seen, of leaders in other institutions. Like, I don't know how many people I shared a tweet that was sent by Mount Allison's AVP at the beginning of some semester, saying something like, "We trust faculty to teach online or in person, depending on, what is best for them." So there, like, I think there have been examples, but I think there have also been lots of examples of that not happening.
Thank you, Suzanne. Juan Carlos, I see your hand, and then we've got a couple of thoughts in the chat afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. A thought-provoking talk, and this is something I've been hearing in different talks in the past few weeks, and it has given me pause, because one of my reflections after the pandemic is like, I did reflect so we went online. We did go online, and we were given the choice later in the fall, and I decided to go full online, but I do labs, right? So that meant a lot of work on my side, and I was taught all my resources, like half.
Yes.
But feeling the privilege that I had, I meant having a job, having a space, being what we were doing great when we thought about what the pandemic meant for other people. So I took on the responsibility, and I said, fine, I'll make this work. And I bent over backwards, to make it work. It worked really well. I created a connection with students, and I did all these things. Of course, I was exhausted at the end of this, like beyond exhausted. And then I realized that I gave everyone a break except for me, right? I felt the weight and the responsibility of this. And we had a talk, talking about our institutions helping us with this. We had a talk from our counseling services here at Acadia, and I went in, how to support students, because that's what's in the forefront of my mind. How do I support people? And it was so funny, because when they went and they talked about all trauma and all these different things, they actually turned it to us and said, how do you take care of yourself? Because you need to, right? And I felt almost tricked into going to the talk, because probably if I had read that this is something to take care of me, I wouldn't have signed up, But I went, and I was so grateful, because it made me think about, I am another person in this equation, and I need that support. And I was small, but at least giving the thought and making us stop and think is really important. So thank you very much, Rachel.
Thank you. And I think, I think that this is like one of these questions that is unanswered for me, but that really is like, how do we make this labor visible and recognized, and make it visible and recognized, and also think about, how we recover, right? How do we regenerate through this, right? Which, my colleague Morgan Bim, who's here, suggested that maybe what I could do with my time here is just scream, like for the for the whole time, which, was a good suggestion. It's another thing we could do that might help, but yeah, I hear you.
Thank you. A great idea for a future Better Together session. It's just a communal screen. I'm going to read 2 comments from the chat, and I think that will have to be our ending after you've responded. Jeanette has shared regarding what we have learned. Learning about decolonizing the classroom space has opened my classes to allow us all to be more human, including grief and loss. And Nicole shares, I'm struck by the idea that while care work has been recognized as critical to education and higher ed, it has also been monetized and diluted by the institutions. Yeah. They say, we care and here is how, but, oh, Siri's trying to do something, hold on. Sorry, I know you didn't get that, thanks. They say, we care and here is how, but these are surface stopgap activities. And the real care work is still, or made even more invisible. How do we get them to see the real care work?
Yeah.
Any thoughts, Rachel?
Well, I mean, I think that a big thing, at least for me, has been around, I think that, so first, on an individual level, I think that it is that process of making it visible to students, to making it visible to our colleagues, doing that. But then I think also a major place that we have to make that visible is through collective agreements, through, how that comes to be, not like the sort of like research is our tippy top, and then teaching is kind of like next, and then service and all that other stuff is sort of underneath, but instead like recognizing how it's a part of our job, compensating it, acknowledging it, and making it important for our processes of, renewal, promotion, all of that, evaluation.
Super. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And thank you everyone for being here today.